Hello and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In each episode, we interview a different scholar, thinker, or writer, asking them to help us myth bust commonly held assumptions about utopias and dystopias.
If you like what you hear, please let us know by following the podcast, rating it on Spotify, or dropping us a message on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. So then, Matt, a slightly different opening from me this time because it is our 1 year anniversary. Our baby is 1 year old. Happy birthday to the Utopian and Dystopian Fictions podcast. What do you think about that?
I can't believe it's been a year. It's one of those ones. I think I always say this to stuff. It feels like it's been no time at all, and then it also feels like it's been forever. Right? I mean, I've got an 8-month-old now, so it's as well in that. So my life has been super busy, and things have but also this is our 16th episode. So it's not just a year, but that's a lot of work, a lot of editing work. You've had to cut a lot of crap from from me. It's been a busy one, and I suppose I didn't know how it would go when we started. I didn't know whether we would do it for a few episodes, try it out, and then not carry on, lose interest in it, or whatever. But I feel like I'm more committed to it certainly than I was when we started. I feel quite energized by the stuff we've done and by the stuff we've got planned, which we'll talk about perhaps in the next sort of episode, because we've got some ideas we've just been chatting about actually. What about you? I mean, we're gonna do I think a roundup episode at some point, but if you were going to pick something from the year that you've particularly enjoyed about doing the podcast, what's it been?
Yeah, I mean, hard to say, isn't it? 16 episodes and lots of really interesting chats with really interesting people across so many different subjects and topics, and some that I'm familiar with and some that I'm totally unfamiliar with. But all of the episodes I have become very familiar with through the editing process and listening back to them several times. I'd say, though, what's been quite exciting, I think, is that maybe in the last, 4, 5, 6 months, we've been lucky enough to not just work with academics and scholars, who, of course, it's always brilliant to work with them, but it's been really exciting to work with people who are also publishing creatively in the space as well. So obviously we had our interview with Eve Smith for her novel. And I just think that was really exciting. It was a bit of a look, mum, I've made it, or like, look, mum, I'm on telly sort of moment, that we'd sort of made it and we'd broken through into maybe a bit of publishing consciousness. I think thanks to maybe some of your reputation rather than my own. But yeah, I thought that was just really exciting. It's really cool to think that we've got people who are accessing and engaging with utopias and dystopias from a whole manner of different perspectives and angles that want to come and chat with us. That's nice. And dare I say it, Matt, it's always a pleasure to have a nice chat with you as well.
You stole my line there. I was going to say that my favorite thing about the podcast was chatting to you every time, Liam. That has been nice, partly because I really enjoy our our half hour or so catch up we have before we record the episodes, which it's been a lot of fun. I would say for me that highlight is a bit of a this sounds really narcissistic, I suspect. But I turned up to a conference where I was giving a keynote paper in Croatia. I can't remember if we talked about it on the podcast. But anyway, I turned up and there I am, never been to Croatia before. Conference about to start. It's not about utopian fiction. It's about violence in contemporary media culture. And someone comes up to me, I think from memory they were Hungarian, but I might be wrong. Someone comes up to me and says, "Oh, I've been listening to your podcast," and I was like, "Oh my god!" that was the I made it.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
pain. Anyway, that was great. I mean, we've got a small listenership, but it's a growing listenership, and it's been great, and it's nice to have some interaction from them.
Mm,
So if you are listening, please do reach out. Let us know, if you're enjoying what we're doing, if you've got suggestions for what we could be doing as well, or you just want to say you really enjoyed a particular episode or a particular speaker. Do let us know. I had really nice to have some interaction from. This is a particularly good one to share. I
mm.
had a message from Sophie Carden. She's a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford, studying Utopia and the history of Yiddish political thought. And
Oh,
she's created a space for people teaching Utopia to share their syllabus, or their reading lists or other teaching materials as well. And so I've actually posted my module outline for Utopian and Dystopian fiction on there. And there's already about, I think, 10 contributors, something like
oh,
that.
wow. Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's shaping up to be like a really good source of inspiration for anyone who might be interested in teaching this stuff. Even if it's just like ideas for a week's worth of teaching on a
Mm.
particular course. So anyway, she did ask me to share this information with listeners. So if you want to view or contribute directly to the list, you can do so. I think you've got to get a Zotero account, which is free. I signed up for it. It's pretty easy. And then join the Teaching Utopia group. We'll put a link to the
Yeah, yeah.
in the episode description as well, as details on how to contact Sophie if you have any difficulties with it. In fact, the description for this episode might have a load of
It'd be
links, a lot
quite
of stuff.
long. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but
Um,
yeah, I wonder if we might then sort of talk about the interview
yeah,
that we've
well,
done for this
I
episode.
I was just thinking, yeah, we've spoken in essence about how much fun we've had in the last year. And as much as I'm teasing about, editing all the interviews and so on, it has been really fun. And I think I know you bemoan that I often edit out the more playful moments in our sort of intros, but I'll try and keep them in this time round. Because our interview this week was on play, right? Play and games and fictional games. And yeah, Matt, I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit more about who you spoke with this time.
Yeah, I'll give a little summary. So I've been had a great time. You'll hear that, I think, in the
Mm.
you can't see because I smile a lot in this, but you can't see it. Um, yeah, great time chatting to Stefano Gualeni, who is a professor at the Institute of Digital Games at the University of Malta, and really interesting guy. His research combines philosophy with digital world building. He's written two novels, one of which we talk about as well in the interview. He's written and designed a number of games, so he comes from a background of kind of game design. You can find a bunch of these games on his website. They're free to play, and I had a go at one of them myself, called something something soup something. That's actually the name of the game. I'm not just ad libbing that. And yeah, he's also the author of the 2022 book called Fictional Games: A Philosophy of World Building and Imaginary Play, which is a book that I sort of came across doing the research for Play in Utopian and Dystopian Fiction, which is the book that I've just put out through Liverpool University Press, which came out. It's literally, I think, 15th of August. So it's been
Mm.
out just over a month at this point. So we can talk a bit about that in a shortly. But yeah, just sort of thinking about the interview at the beginning of the interview, he told me a bit about his background in game development, his controversial, this is his word, I think, for a
Yeah.
decision to pivot into academia, where people thought he was crazy. Why leave a job from in a kind of designing video games to go into academia? I sort of found myself questioning that move as well. But yeah, so from there we discussed something close to my interest, which is his work on fictional games,
Mm.
i.e., games that do not exist outside of their literary or sort of textual context. In particular, we sort of talked about how such games are often important philosophical tools for communicating the central ideas of a text. So even if they're kind of, games that are on the margins of the text or are kind of, just very talked about very briefly, not central, they still sort of often communicate really important ideas, ideologies that the writers are trying to communicate. And yeah, ultimately, the games people choose to play can tell us what kind of values are upheld by a particular society. So this applies to games, obviously in utopian and dystopian settings, where they tend to map the oppressive structures of the society, particularly in dystopias anyway. We carried on discussing things like the act of creation and writing as fundamentally a sort of playful act as well, branching out into a kind of broader discussion briefly of the genre. And after that, I sort of quizzed Stefano on his recently published novel, which was called What We Owe the Dead. I really, really enjoyed reading that. Liam, I know you haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I think you would get a real kick out of it. Lots of endo texts in there for you to enjoy.
Sounds like, yeah.
It's an experimental detective story set in a future dystopia. And yeah, we particularly sort of discussed this idea of experimentation as part of the writing process. And some of the discussion also was about sort of world building. And so it kind of took me back to the interview I think you gave with Nathan, or did with Nathan Waddell, about the difficulties of writing elegant dystopias. That was the episode about Orwell. And something I think Stefano has really tried to do in the novel is think about that form quite a lot. So he's not trying. He said himself he's trying not to patronize the reader by leading them too far into one direction. And so the novel, as he describes it, is quote unquote peripherally dystopian. So while it's clear that some disaster has occurred, mostly what we're seeing is people getting on with their lives and kind of commenting only infrequently on the dystopian world they inhabit. Anyway, so we end up sort of coming back round in the interview to questions about fictional games through the fictional game or found game that appears in that book that he's written. And we end up by talking actually a bit more about the writing process and about sort of writing as an academic and the challenges that we sort of encounter if we try to do that in our academic world today. And I thought that was a really interesting way of finishing up the interview.
Yeah, it was an interview that I really enjoyed listening to. I mean, I always do enjoy listening to the interviews that you're conducting. But yeah, there's so much about the chat with Stefano that just really caught my interest, whether it was him talking about his novel, What We Owe the Dead, which, yeah, sounds hugely endotextual, and sort of his discussion of like fictional games resonates quite a lot with some of the things I was discussing in my own work about these fictional texts that we only find in the novels that we're reading. And he sort of said some things that even sort of word for word is almost how I was talking about some of these texts. He was talking about how these are games that we can't actually play because that they're only in these novels, and that just really interested me. It's made me want to go back and read his scholarly work, but also his fiction too. I think talking about play and playfulness, I think we've spoken a lot in this podcast, and it comes in this episode too, about how the utopian and dystopian genres are inherently playful, right? They are at minimum thought experiments, and that is very, very playful. But also it seems like in What We Owe the Dead, there's a lot of formal sort of playfulness too. There's a subverting of expectations or tropes or conventions that he's doing there. I think you guys both sort of say in the episode that it's sort of a detective novel about the wrong detective or about the wrong case. And again, I think that's quite subversive and innovative, playful. I think all of his words are sort of doing a similar thing there. One thing though that came right towards the end of the interview that was for me like really empowering, exciting, something that again resonated with some of the thoughts I was having during my own thesis, during my own PhD, was he was discussing, I think, the sort of the relationship between his scholarly critical work and his fiction. And in essence, and I'm really, really simplifying what he said here because he puts it far more eloquently than I will here. He was saying that he talked about a thing in his scholarly work, i.e. fictional games. It went, all right, now I'm going to do that in my fiction too. So like I've almost got not only have I talked about examples that are in other people's work here, but now I'm sort of putting it into practice as well. And I just thought that was really exciting. And again, like as someone who in my thesis, I talk about and sort of conceptualize and taxonomize a thing that maybe hadn't been treated in those ways previously. It's something that, for a long time, my master's is in creative writing. For a long time, I would also want to write something, creatively that then does the exact thing that I'm talking about. Almost, I guess, as like a proof of concept. Sort of proving that I'm not just making this thing up. Like it can actually exist, right? So yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but I just really, really enjoyed the interview. So thank you, Matt, for your time there, and thank you as well to Stefano for his brilliant insights.
It's making me think, Liam, we've often said that this podcast creates extensive to be read lists where we create a lot of work for ourselves, probably for our listeners as well. Well, you just sort of take that to the next level. You've now given yourself a novel that you've got to write off the back of this. So you've just got to read them. You've got to write one now. That's really creating work for yourself.
Well, I mean, I'm nothing if not a glutton for punishment. But Matt, on work and play, work and play in utopian and dystopian fiction. You have quite a lot to say about the relationship between work and play in your book. And I said it's just been published recently by Liverpool University Press, and I'll be sure to include a link to it in the description. Don't you worry. I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about your book as well. I mean, this isn't sort of shameless promotion. It's just quite fortunate that we've timed the interview with Stefano brilliantly to sort of.
Well, it is shameless promotion.
Okay, I was trying to like you're revealing how the sausage is made, Mark. Don't pull back the curtain.
Well, we discussed it. We thought that we did discuss whether or not to have an episode just on the book. I mean, it was a nice thing. One privilege of doing this extra work, if you like, of doing the podcast, is that you get to talk about your own research. So it kind of made a lot of sense, but we thought that might be a bit too narcissistic. So this is a kind of, as Stefano would say, have your cake and eat it. So I could talk a bit about the book, Liam. I had a lot of fun writing it. I mean, just thinking about the process of writing it very briefly, it mostly came together last year in a panic, knowing that I had a child incoming and that would never ever be able to write anything ever again. I kind of really mostly wrote it over the summer, actually. But it's been something that I've been thinking about for quite a few years. So during my teaching utopian and dystopian fiction, I've obviously read a lot of texts, and for some reason I've been dog-earing sort of pages, which is, I'm sure, a terrible practice for all these books, just on anything which had a kind of fictional game or a link to play in some way, shape or form. And I knew at some point I wanted to write about it, but I didn't quite know, it ended up being years worth of research in some way. And, and I tried to bring it all together, and it came together very quickly, partly because I'd kind of been thinking about it for a while. But well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the best ways of thinking about the book is I open the book with a quote from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I kind of feel sums up one of the central ideas of the book. So the quote is, "It is an important and popular fact that things are not always what they seem. For instance, on the planet Earth, man had always assumed that he was more intelligent than dolphins because he had achieved so much: the wheel, New York, wars, and so on, whilst all the dolphins had ever done was muck about in the water having a good time. But conversely, the dolphins had always believed that they were far more intelligent than man for precisely the same reasons." I mean, it's fun, it's playful, right? I mean, it's Douglas Adams, I think at his best in that book, right? But it kind of gets to the central plea, if you like, of the book as I was envisaging it, which is that it's really a request for us to think more about the importance of play in society as a whole. But when you try to teach utopia in particular, utopian fiction, I find you often run up against resistance from people, maybe cynics who, not entirely irrationally, I would add, believe that utopias are, by extension rather, utopian fiction are boring, right? That's part of the reason I think that we wanted to do this podcast in a way, or that I was motivated by, challenging that. Utopias, because of their perfectionism, this is sort of, as the argument goes, must be static. Once perfection is achieved, utopias must be, by definition, come to a kind of halt. And likewise, utopians are people who take their job too seriously. These are all kind of accusations that get thrown. By contrast, of course, utopia's cousin dystopia is often seen as exciting, right? Dystopian fiction is fast-paced, action-oriented, dynamic, heroic, etc. In the book, I'm trying to really kind of upend this distinction by firstly showing how utopian fiction is fundamentally playful and fun, and secondly, how dystopian fiction tends to depict societies in stasis, where it is stasis itself that is dystopian. By that logic, we must kind of actually associate utopia with dynamism and dystopia with stasis, right? And yet, as part of this, there are broader political dimensions to the argument I make in the book, particularly relating to sort of building a world where we work substantially less, which I think is really at the heart of a lot of the classical blueprint utopias, like More's originary travel narrative, the great 19th century utopias like Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, William Morris's News for Nowhere, which we've talked about several times on the podcast. And also to think about how we might use things like technology to achieve this. And I think, another way of getting one's head around the book is to think about two of the most influential texts that I sort of, that really kind of crop up several times, at least throughout the book. One being Bernard Suitz's Book of Philosophy, which interestingly enough, Stefano mentioned in the interview. So he's obviously sort of familiar with it as well, called The Grasshopper. And the other one being Star Trek: The Next Generation, which I'll tell you about in a second. But yeah, Suits in particular writes a great little philosophical treatise on playing games in the 1970s, which I can't recommend enough. It's really, as philosophy goes, it's very entertaining and a lot of fun to read. And it's called The Grasshopper: Games, Life and Utopia. I draw on it quite heavily in the book. And I'll say a bit more. But the other one, frankly, is kind of not a very glamorous story, but as I was writing the book over the summer, I also happened to be watching or rewatching The Next Generation, which I hadn't watched since a kid, and it's a brilliant series, absolutely wonderful. I just found it creeping into the writing at various points because so many of the episodes just seemed really relevant to what I was arguing. Like on any given day, whatever I was watching just happened to end up in the book somehow. But I thought maybe I'll just sort of say a little bit about Suits, because I think his book can help us sort of think about play a little bit more. So fundamentally, his little book is an attempt to philosophically, at least, answer the question, what is a game? But in the process, he ends up doing quite a lot more than that. So he's reconfiguring Aesop's fable of the grasshopper and the ant. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but essentially the fable is that the grasshopper dies when the winter comes because it has spent all summer playing, whereas the ant survives because it spent all summer working, like stockpiling for the winter. And Suits kind of turns this idea on its head and says, well, what if we lived in a world without material scarcity? A utopia in effect. Wouldn't it actually be the grasshopper who triumphs in such a scenario? We'd kind of laugh at the ant who kind of, just works needlessly in that environment. And so, the questions sort of abound from this. To what extent have we actually maybe already reached that world? In fact, his book sort of ends up arguing that in a utopia, everything that we do or would do essentially would fall under the category of gaming in some capacity, as he lays it out in the book, which I think is a really interesting idea. So anyway, just as a kind of overview, really, the book is kind of a premise for the book's interdisciplinary exploration of utopian and dystopian texts, literary, filmic, televisual. There's even the odd video game there. I think I counted something like 80 different texts that I end up discussing at some point or another throughout the book. And the book starts with several chapters on classical and more contemporary utopian fiction, before several middle chapters on dystopian texts, and then synthesizes these in final chapters on one on kind of comedy and the absurd in utopian dystopian fiction, and the other considering the future of play through kind of digital and gaming worlds, sort of bringing it up to date. So that's my spiel on the book, if you like. It wasn't brief. I did warn you in advance that it wouldn't be brief, but there you go.
you have covered so many texts in the book. I'm just like skimming through the intro where you do sort of like the chapter summaries, and just to give people a flavour. Probably unsurprisingly to them, Moore's Utopia, as you've already said, is mentioned. It's probably the text that we've talked about the most in one form or another in the podcast. We've got Callenbach's Ecotopia, Skinner's Walden 2, Ian Banks's The Player of Games, Time Machine by Wells. I'm just skimming here. We've got Plato's Republic, Bacon's The New Atlantis, News from Nowhere, Erewhon, The Machine Stops, 1984, The Testaments, Handmaid's Tale. I could probably keep going, so I will. Ender's Game, Tender as the Flesh, Battle Royale, Squid Game, Chain Gang All Stars. I was really pleased to see you mention that. For some reason,
I think I've written about 3,000 words or something on that in the book, and it's quite extensive.
It's a great text. I know we've mentioned it a few times now, and I wrote it in my notes for Stefano's interview. Sorry, I can't remember why now, so I've just put there Chain Gang All Stars. So we mentioned it at least. Snowpiercer, one of actually my favourite movies of all time. Demolition Man. I could go on and go on and go on. What I will though do, Matt, is I'm gonna play an Uno reverse card on you and do the thing that all writers love, which is when people quote them at themselves. Don't feel worried. I
you need to narrate my grimaced face there.
Yeah, Matt pulled a face. No, I just thought I'd share a piece of wisdom that appears quite early in your first chapter, where you've talked about Star Trek, The Next Generation for a little bit. And you say, and I quote, "Is not the real utopia hinted at here simply an orgy in deep space?"
Yeah.
We'll leave that decontextualized. Matt, I think we've understandably had quite a long intro here. I hope listeners, I hope you forgive us, but we've got both the year's anniversary to celebrate. Stefano's. I'm sorry, Stefano, if you're listening back to this. Stefano's great interview as well, which honestly is fantastic. But we wanted to celebrate Matt's book coming out too, and sort of, I guess, having that little discussion of it, serving as a counterpart piece, a companion to the interview at large. So, Matt, how do you feel about us passing over to yourself and Stefano for a brilliant chat about all things Utopia and play and fictional games?
Yeah, I feel great about it, and I'm looking forward to the jingle. I'm delighted to have with us for this interview Stefano Gualeni. Could you please introduce yourself to our audience, Stefano?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. And well, I would describe myself as a mammal, bipedal one, who happens to enjoy games and science fiction. I'm lucky enough to have secured a position as a full professor at a research institute in a small island called Malta. I think that pretty much covers it. I don't know, would you like to know something in particular?
Well, we're going to be talking about particularly fictional games, which I know that you are interested in. And also, I did have the pleasure of reading your novel, which I think it's out this year, wasn't it? What We Owe the Dead. And so we'll talk a bit about that. So yeah, a little bit about your research background, and maybe you're interested in games as well, because I believe you write your own games. You might sort of tell our audience a little bit about that.
That is right. I mean, maybe to understand what I do for a living and what my professorship is all about, the public might need to know that I used to be a game developer in the late 90s, beginning of 2000s. Then I got a bit tired. It's a very difficult life. It's a very demanding job, long hours, a lot of crunch. And so I decided to go back to academia, which was not a popular choice at the time, in a sense that my family was like, what? You have a future-oriented job, which is tech adjacent, and you already have a career. At the time, I did something like 11 or 12 commercial games. And instead, I went back to reading the Greeks and the Germans. And yeah, you can understand that was a bit of a controversial choice. But I didn't see the two things, that is, making games and studying philosophy, as being sort of on opposite ends of a hypothetical spectrum. I thought they were pretty close to one another in a sense that in my mind, I would be able to use philosophy to think about games better, to study games better. And at the same time, I would perhaps be able to use my the game development background, mostly game design and writing, to contribute to philosophy from another angle, as in to try to make philosophical games or interactions that communicate philosophical ideas, or give rise to small worlds that give rise to philosophical questions, right? So it's still within. I've listened to some of the episodes of this podcast, and I understand that this idea of using literature or fiction more generally for speculation is at the heart of what you're discussing and doing here. So what I tried to do at the beginning of my academic career is to show that virtual interactions, which are perhaps more commonly visible in video games or in the form of video games, could be a vehicle towards communicating some philosophical ideas, some notions, some points of view. And so I did that for a little bit. And if you feel like playing philosophical games of that sort, you can go on my website, which I presume Matthew and the other people responsible for these podcasts will put in the description and so on and so forth. So that was the core of the beginning of my career. And then I went into a number of different directions, including studying what you mentioned in your question, games that do not exist. So games that only exist as elements of a larger work of fiction. So games that function like fictional props. So in a sense, I was interested in figuring out whether not only games could be philosophical tools. In my opinion, it's pretty obvious that those playful interactions can communicate important ideas, but whether we could also ascribe an expressive or philosophical value to games that don't exist, to games that we cannot access as players because they're part of fictions and they're normally incomplete and just sketchily described, or they contain elements of mystery or magic or advanced technologies that make them impossible to be accessed as players from the point of view of the audience. So that's the idea of fictional games, and it was originally published in a 2022 book by Bloomsbury, which tries to make a point of, well, look at this phenomenon and look at how we never quite gotten to study it until maybe also, Matthew, your book came out and is on a very related topic. And if you're interested, the book is called Fictional Games, A Philosophy of World Building and Imaginary Play, and is published by Bloomsbury. So that's the idea.
Brilliant. Thanks. That was very thorough. And, you know, that sticking on that title, Fictional Games, A Philosophy of World Building and Imaginary Play, which, yeah, as you said, you know, is obviously something that piqued my interest. It's kind of connected, but not overtly, to utopian and dystopian fiction, right? So, you know, what particularly interested you in the way in which these fictional games are able to communicate ideologies, perhaps in you know, relation to utopian and dystopian societies? Do you find that a lot? Are they being used as a kind of mechanism to drive a particular philosophy that underpins the society that's being depicted? And do you have perhaps some examples that you might give us for that?
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head there. I think as part of, let's say, secondary world building, so elements of a larger world, games can give indication to, say, the reader, of the moviegoer or the theater goer, as to what kind of values are upheld in that particular society or in the particular fictional world that we are experiencing in that situation. So they might suggest an interest in, I don't know, warfare, or the optimization of one's behavior with a practical purpose in mind. There might be games instead that facilitate collaboration and personal imagination of fanciful flights and so on and so forth. So I noticed that very much like actual games that can vehicle ideologies, information, and maybe visions of our collective futures, fictional games were doing very similar things, like within the works they were part of, often had ideological or utopian values. One example, since you asked that question, that I want to raise here is a famous short story by Philip K. Dick called War Game. I don't know if you remember it. It's in, I think it was written in the 60s, maybe 63. And he makes a specific point that like cultural colonization or a change in society can happen starting from the youth and from the games that we play, because they are shaping experiences. They're not simply, well, some games are complete wastes of time. I'm thinking like interaction, just feel good moments. But many of the games we play, willingly or not, contain information, indicate what is an ethical behavior, what is a good life, what is socially acceptable. They indicate maybe a direction that we should work towards in our collective future. That is also the case, for example, I wrote a paper in 2000, I think it was 21, called Fictional Games and Utopia, the Case of Azad. The game of Azad is a particularly central game to one of the books of the Culture series by Ian Banks. The book came out in 1983 and it's called The Player of Games. And you can tell straight by the title the importance that games have in that particular novel. And that's another great example of how a game, in this case not a secondary background game, but a very central one to the plot and the world building, can be let's say, an instrument of power, an ideological structure, and maybe even a tool to leverage the possibility to think about and to bring about a different kind of future. You can find many of these examples in literature and movies. If you think about games such as, for example, the Hunger Games, like the arena with all its technological limitations and possibilities, or Squid Game, you would definitely be shown a dystopian use of games in which the game in a way match the structure of power that oppresses the people who are in a way forced or highly in a way encouraged to play those kind of games. So not only we can have a utopian project that can be pursued through a game or in the form of a game, but also games exist within fictions as dystopian elements, obviously. Those games tend to replicate the structure of power and negative values and the oppression and the cruelty that in a way characterizes the political structure or the elite who runs those kind of games. Even think of, I don't know, movies such as The Running Man, based on a novel by, if I'm not mistaken, is by Stephen King. Or The Maze or The Cube and those kind of things. Like, you have a direct correspondence between like a techno-social environment that is oppressive and highly hierarchical, and almost one-to-one that is mapped onto a game show or ludic structure of some kind. So I think those examples in a way qualify both the positive, let's say, utopian uses of games towards a better future, toward a better understanding of ourselves and the society in which we live, and maybe of our future aspirations, and a negative side of fictional games, which is that of, in a way, portraying a fragment, a shard of a dystopian whole, which is, again, the political context.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously something I've written about recently, so it's very fresh in my mind. And I'm thinking about a bunch of different sort of games in text that are running through my mind. Of course, you do have the Hunger Games, which is, the major sort of piece, if you like, in the book. But I think more often these are minor sort of elements of a fictional world, which nevertheless seem to encapsulate sort of the ethos of the writer or the world that the writer is depicting. I'm thinking, for example, about Thomas More briefly mentions in Utopia about this game of vices and virtues, and it's sort of this sense that they play games, but they play games in order to teach a moral kind of philosophical lesson, which in some ways I always kind of found interesting, because it could be it can be a way to sort of critique utopia, to say, well, even games in utopia are kind of dull or boring. And I'm now thinking of kind of Ernest Callenbach's Ecotopia, where they play the ritual war games, and it's a kind of a kind of mini sort of battle or conflict. And I think that's a kind of an attempt by the author to sort of suggest that there is this kind of element to humanity that we need to release. It's this tension that we need to release, which is actually kind of a negative sort of view of humanity. We need war in some capacity, and this is a way of sort of satisfying that itch, but in a sort of safe environment. I never quite liked that, but I was particularly interested with the writing I've been doing on thinking about the genre itself of utopian fiction, and to a lesser extent dystopian fiction as itself a kind of game, or a kind of playful enterprise. And again, to quote Callenbach in his in sort of his, I think is a preface, I think it's a postscript or whatever to his book, he writes that, quote, "Constructing an imaginary society is a little like designing a game. The society evolves rules, principles, and conventions, and the author is not entirely in charge," which I thought is kind of an interesting sort of take on this this idea that brings to mind, the central kind of argument of my book is really that we tend to think of dystopian fiction as kind of fun, playful, because of things like the Hunger Games. It's exciting, you get these page turners, there's drama, etc. But actually, they're quite often repetitive, quite samey, tedious. The worlds they construct certainly not worlds we want to live in. Whereas utopian fiction tends actually to be quite playful, quite fun by its nature, tongue-in-cheek. You can go right back to sort of Moore's text and think about the kind of the satire there. And as I said, the kind of actual process of building these worlds is itself a kind of playful process. So it's something I like to do in classes, is have fun with students and kind of ask them to build their own world. So this is kind of why I'm particularly interested to sort of hear your sort of experience with writing, designing video games, and do you use them in the classroom?
This is a very interesting set of questions. I think it is a bundle of questions that will take a lot of time.
Apologies, there was an assault of questions, perhaps. Yeah.
They're all very good. Like, they're a bit massive, like, because I cannot pick apart one strand at a time. I could tell you that I agree with you that sort of speculative fiction, so the kind which invites us to imagine a world and a what if, and the possibility for us to actually ever be in that state, and what would it mean to be humans and to lead a good life or to behave ethically under those conditions. They all are pretty playful. I agree with you. Like, that is sort of like at least in the role-playing game sense of playful. Another famously playful kind of literature is, at least if we listen to Bernard Suits, the American philosopher, is also detective fiction, right? In that one in particular, the designer engages a sort of like game of obfuscation and dead ends and illusion, and with the player who on their side are supposed to sort of engage in this challenge and try to figure out whatever mystery or whoever the culprit is of this particular work before the fictional author, the fictional detective does, right? So there's a number of playful uses of literature. The utopian one can definitely be playful. And you mentioned the fact that I sometimes do other things other than games and academic writing, which is fiction writing. And well, lo and behold, the book I decided to write very recently, which is a science fiction detective novel, has both these aspects, right? It plays with a dystopian, eco-catastrophic world in which a detective novel takes place, or a detective case takes place. So in responding at least half of your question, I agree with you completely, and I try to push it even further by adding another playful layer, which is that of the detection, right, of the mystery novel. And so as a game designer, as somebody interested in games, I think it was appropriate to be also an author of fiction that is playful with their audience and playful with the format of the work, and playful in a number of different ways, which is not limited to, sadly, the dystopian dimension of it or the world building dimension of it. I hope this answers at least a portion, a fragment of your question.
Yeah, well, it leads us nicely on to your novel, which I can't remember if I already mentioned the title. It's What We Owe the Dead, and I had great fun reading it. It's a short novel, but it's got a lot going on, certainly in terms of its sort of philosophical depth. And I thought, well, I'd mention the subtitle of your novel, which is an experimental detective novel set in a dystopian society. You know, novels don't usually have subtitles, so I guess it's sort of already hinting at the kind of philosophical angle that you're taking and the kind of sort of mixture of the kind of academic work that you do with the kind of fictional form. But I wondered that, you know, if you might tell us a bit about what in your view is experimental about the novel, and maybe also why that might be important to you. What sort of importance do you place on experimentation, given that we've just been talking about maybe that as part of the kind of playful nature of utopian and dystopian fiction more generally, is that kind of experimentation as part of the process?
You mentioned something like the undertitle or the subtitle, but that, I mean, maybe it's not very common in modern novels, but if you read, for example, Eco's essays or Gerard Jeanette, Soil like Thresholds, there's a whole discussion on historical novels and the meaning of the subtitle and so on and so forth. So I will not bore you with that one. That is not the original.
It's a good point. I mean, Thomas More's, you know, got a very long subtitle for his novel, or not novel, his travel narrative. But yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
Well, if you ask me what's experimental about it, like I could give you a few hints. So this is a detective novel, and somebody was stupid enough to let me publish it, and that's already great. In this day and age, it's not easy, I suppose, to even get somebody to listen to you. So what is experimental? What did I, in a way, front-loaded as experimental traits that might make this stand out or maybe interest the readers? First and foremost, when you read a detective novel, it is normally a novel about a mystery case or a detection case. In this case, I decided to write a novel which is an investigation, but not on a mystery, but on another investigation. So it's a meta-investigation, and that's pretty weird. Instead of having it written as a, let's say, classical novel with a, like, I don't know, omniscient narrator or some kind of focalization and so on and so forth, I decided to pretend that this is a draft of the report on this investigation on an investigation. That means that it's written with a degree of detachment and objectivity, but being a draft, it also contains personal notes and erased text. So that is pretty also original, I believe, in a sense that you have both the, let's say, like the factual or attempts at factual depiction of whatever happened, and which is supposed to be objective, detached, whatever, and yet you have these sort of little small insights, fractures in which the character, the one writing the this report, shines through with their opinion and the small personality traits and preferences and so on and so forth. So that was another little experimental way in which I could have both my cake and eat it too, right? I could have both the objective and the subjective, both the impersonal and the personal. And it's also quite funky to read. I suppose you will tell me about it, Matthew, if like that was kind of familiar to you or comfortable or interesting to spy into somebody's inner life while looking at somewhere else. Anyway, and the last thing, and I'm really waiting for you to tell me something about it, is the fact that similar to my previous novel, this is number 2, it contains some philosophical points that are in a way prepared in 2 different fashions. So it is as if I had, like, as a philosopher, my ingredients that I want to use in this particular work, and I cooked them in one way in the fiction, and then I cooked them in a different way in another part of the book, which is a part that is non-fiction. In the previous book, I had 3 essays at the end of the book that in a way treated the themes of the book in a way that is more conventional, like a scholar does, right? So I'm telling you exactly what I meant and how I realized it and what I want you to think about and so on and so forth. In this new book, What We Owe the Dead, there is still an academic part at the end Only in this case, just to be even more freaky than the book already is, it is written by a fictional academic within the fictional world of the book. So it's actually theory fiction. So I tell you what I think and what you should be thinking about, both in a form of a fiction and in form of a theory fiction. And those two elements are between the two covers of the book, which makes it like a, again, pretty unusual work given how heterogeneous it is. I would like to know, Matthew, what you thought about the book, whether those, I would not call them innovation because I'm not after, say, that in particular, but at least like aspects of uniqueness, perhaps, or quirky ways to achieve my objectives, and how they resonated with you, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I would add as well, there's also an afterword, which I thought was really, I mean, personally, because of my interests in sort of fictional games, etc., I thought the afterword was really, really useful and fascinating, and that is you kind of reflecting on some responses that early readers, I think, gave you to the book, which I'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, I mean, just in response to the kind of question about experimentation, I did think the style was really interesting. I liked the element, as you say, of having your cake and eating it. To begin with, I wasn't sure, am I supposed to read this twice? Am I supposed to read the draft version?
I have a funny story about that if you want, but maybe
go on. Tell your funny story.
As you can imagine, I'm not a native speaker, and also I'm not a professional writer, and so I'm pretty insecure about I'm not insecure about my ideas, but maybe about the way my ideas sound when I write them in English. So to, in a way, lessen this anxiety, I normally work with a lot of readers. I normally do 3 versions of the novel, and each version is read by 4 different people and so on. So I send this draft to one of my readers, and that reader thought that I mentioned that the novel is itself in a draft form. It's a draft of a report. But this person thought that the novel was in a draft form, as in the author. I was kind of insecure as to what to delete, and I left personal notes in the text. So she decided not to read them, as in like I want, and so I had the possibility to see whether the report in itself was holding water, even without all the sort of having my cake on the side, so without all the subjective and experimental bits. So we had one person that, receiving a draft, was obviously confused as to whether she needed to read the deleted parts and the personal notes. But perhaps the experience of a reader, a normal reader, is different, because you get the book beautifully packaged and wrapped in paper, and you're no longer under any kind of doubt as to whether that is a finished work, I suppose, or a draft that you can take freedoms with.
I think you can absolutely read it in both ways, and I thought that it was nice because in some capacity the world building, a lot of the world building can go on in the sort of deleted notes section, because and you can read it as a more straightforward police procedural kind of style text, or you can read to get a lot more of the kind of flavor of what that living in that space is actually like. I'd quite like to draw attention to some of the comments from the early readers actually in the afterword, because I thought they were really interesting. I'm going to quote here. I hope this doesn't constitute a spoiler for your text, but this book does not go anywhere. It feels like a roller coaster ride where the train remains perfectly still and it's the track that moves around it instead. I thought that was a really interesting one. And then I thought also was interesting that you yourself, and you kind of hinted at that in your description, called it a, quote, mystery novel with no mystery, and a detective story that follows the wrong detective. I think that's a really great way of describing it, the detective story that follows the wrong detective, which you again, that is a bit of a spoiler. You only kind of really find that out a bit later, that this isn't necessarily the person that would have been as interesting to follow as someone else might have been. But it's a fascinating way, I think, of thinking about the novel, that I think, it seemed very deliberate as well, that these were deliberate choices you made, that the novel has a kind of a slow pace, but not in an unenjoyable way. So I certainly found myself wanting to get to the next bit, but yeah, I kind of couldn't tell you that a lot was happening. It goes back to that sort of, the book doesn't go anywhere, but it sort of feels a bit like a roller coaster ride. So did you kind of worry writing this that might put people off a little bit. You know, we're in the kind of world where we expect kind of detective stories in a way to be that sort of page turner, to have all these kinds of things that are keeping the plot very, very heavily plotted, keeping it moving forward. And here we're kind of deliberately slowing down and pausing over kind of what often feels like incidental details. I mean, that also goes back to the kind of draft nature, because you're not sure whether, you know, the writer isn't sure whether or not the draft bit should be or shouldn't be included. How important is this piece of information? And so you as a reader are trying to work out, oh, maybe this is important. How much is this incidental detail and how much is this actually something I should be paying attention to? So yeah, when you were sort of writing this, did you really think about how the readers might respond to it? Did you really care about that? You know, what was the process there?
I talked about this with Marco Caracciolo, who's a scholar of post-human literature and post-humanity in literature and eco-criticism and those kind of things. Because during one of the events related to the launch of the book, he asked the same question, in a sense that not really whether I was interested or concerned about the reader's response, because that is not necessarily what I would like to do. Actually, if I find that in literature, that the author is trying too hard to elicit certain emotions or tries to keep me reading using literary devices or plot devices, I feel like sort of patronized. And I mean, that is not necessarily the most interesting part of literature. So the need to keep my attention and expectations going. So I wrote more like a book that I would have liked to write. And in that sense, it was deliberate to make it into a peripheral kind of literature. What do I mean by that? It's not really like I'm peripheral because I'm not a native speaker and I live on an island on the southern border of Europe. I mean, there are aspects of periphery that probably made it into the book in some way. But what happens here is that we do not follow the important case. And something happened to our world, which is now sort of like limited to giant tubes of air conditioning, basically, after an ecological catastrophe. And what would be interesting to talk about in this book might be what happened and how society adapted to the new normal, and what kind of social and political changes, and also to the way we eat, to the way we relate to one another, the way we relate to surveillance, for example. Those are things that are very important to the society in which the book takes place. But again, the presumed center of what is interesting about this world is treated as a side detail or something in the background, something that we only hear about obliquely. So, and instead we focus on a seemingly marginal detective case, which is mostly like a procedure that is not particularly useful to anybody. So the idea here is also to get a bit away from, say, heroism or the need for literature to say something central and to be bold about it. Like, even it's interesting in its own sake, but it tries not to be too forward. It's like a very oblique book that I suppose tries to make the periphery the center and the center the periphery, and the two remain visible to one another, but in a way that is slightly less obvious and maybe less annoying than in most dystopian fiction, when instead, like, obviously the main characters worry about the situation, the dystopian situation at hand, whereas in this book, like, they kind of live it as their everyday life. They hardly ever comment. I mean, there's traffic moving from one sector to the other, or the temperature is too high today, whatever, but you don't necessarily get to know what happened and how society responded. So there was a deliberate idea of not be too forward, not be too annoying, and just write an entertaining book, which is peripherally dystopian, right? In a way that is natural and not too forward. And of course, that was deliberate. And I might be writing another one in this same form, and I would still try not to be too literary, right? Like, I would like to sort of be like, it's almost, somebody else commented among my readers that this feels more like a theater piece, right? In fact, I believe it's more theatrical than literary as a book. And the whole thing, claustrophobic as that might sound, actually takes place only in 3 rooms, right? It's an investigation in 3 rooms, and yet it lasts for like 60,000 words almost, and hopefully manages to keep you going despite the fact that almost nothing happens, and it's all in 3 rooms. And so why the heck am I reading this? Maybe Matthew, you found something useful about this. To me, that was an exercise. There was something fun to do. It's the kind of book that I would like to read. So that's my excuse. I hope that kind of begins to answer your question. But yes, it is deliberate, and I know it's weird. I hope it still worked its way into your interest. And yeah.
It's one of those things where I'm going to probably butcher the quote, but it's something along these lines. I'm minded of Kazuo Ishiguro's writing, in that, you know, he talks in an early interview about how he was interested in having you know, the reader go from A to B without having the plot take you from A to B. So A to B becomes, you know, the B there becomes a kind of philosophical realization about something, and the plot doesn't have to be the thing that takes you there. And I thought that about this novel, really, that it wasn't driven at all by plot, really, but it wasn't. Yeah, it was interesting. You know, you could equally have a very boring book that wasn't driven by plot and just did, you know, nothing really happened. But it wasn't like that. You were sort of turning a screw, very, very slowly and deliberately, I felt. Yeah, I mean, without sort of spoiling it, you know, at the end of the text, you ask some really interesting philosophical questions, I think, that kind of draw together your own interests and the overlaps between philosophy, literature, and games. Might you say a little bit about the connection between, because we haven't really talked about gaming in relation to the actual book, other than the actual, the kind of text itself. We haven't talked about there is a sort of plot line, if you like, that does involve a fictional game. Might you say a little bit about that?
I would love to. The book itself touches on, I believe, like 3 ideas that are of a philosophical nature, according to me at least. One is the notion of personhood, which is kind of challenged in a number of different ways in the novel. The other one is the titular question of what we owe the dead. So in what relationship are we to the ones that came before us and to the recently deceased, right? So that is also treated in that kind of semi-academic essay at the end of the book. And there's one more plot point, or rather, sorry, maybe not plot point, but theme that is recurrent through the novel, which is, I suppose, what you were referring to, which is how games are, in a way, foundational or helpful in the structuring of society. And there is a part of the plot that concerns itself with a fictional game called Conduit. I'm mentioning this because I started to write fiction as a way to walk the walk. Let me explain you what I mean. I told you that I went to philosophy to study games, and if my point was that games can be vehicles for certain philosophical experience and questions, what I decided to do, starting from my PhD, is to show it, right? So make games that do that in a way that is provable or evident or particularly cleverly explained, or maybe even self-reflexive, in which the games that I make explain that games can be philosophical. This is a similar idea, only with fictional games, right? I write a book and start a research line about fictional games and the cultural and philosophical and expressive potential that these kind of fictional props, these games that don't exist, can have within a work of fiction. And instead of just analyzing it and talking about it and try to taxonomize it in my Bloomsbury book, what I try to do is also, as I mentioned, walk the walk, meaning that I'm going to write fiction or work in fictions that show you that fictional games can have a profound impact or can be used as philosophical tools and so on and so forth. So I try to be this kind of academic that is showing also what they think in practice as a way to, in a way, make their point more salient or more evident or more practical. So in both my, let's say, fictions, the 2 novels that I wrote, games have a central place. And they explore 2 different ways in which fictional games can work within works of fiction. In the case of What We Owe the Dead, Conduit is a strange kind of game that is a found game. So normally we invent game. We have figures like the game designers who, based on their sensitivity and their background, come up with new playable experiences that could work in the society where they exist. What would happen if we found a game? Would we understand it? How would we be able to adapt it to our culture and so on? That is the case of Conduit. That is a game that is found since the ecological catastrophe. The ice caps have melted. And on the bottom of that, in digging the foundation for one of the great giant siphoned mega tower in which the novel takes place, somebody found the remains of an old spaceship. It looks like we've been visited by an alien civilization, or at least a ship crashed into our planet about 35 million years before. Which is kind of a bit sad, like it's been invited to a party and then you go there and everybody left 35 million years earlier. But they left something together with some kitchenware and so on, and whoever found it, the archaeologists that studied it, figured out that it was something similar to a political decision-making tool, or maybe something playful, maybe something like a game. And with the help of artificial intelligence and many years of study, they figured out more or less how to play this alien game. Imagine that this is also like a novel that is a first contact novel, only the most boring kind of first contact, where everybody's already dead, right? And that it was a line in the story. I don't know if you remember. So this game originally is just like a little, like, what do you call it? Like a little world building little tool on the side. It comes back a couple of times, but towards the end of the novel, and I'm not going to explain it more, it becomes more relevant to the plot, more central to what the plot means, and also more central to what the question, what we owe the dead, means. In this case, we found and adapted and continue to play a game that was not built by our civilization, by somebody who is now presumably long dead. What rights do we have? How do we approach it? How do we make sense of that culture through a game? All of those questions are then in a way digested in a more organic fashion at the end of the book. So there is a plot that is connected to the use of games as social tools and as traces of the past. Just as a additional anecdote, I was recently, when I talked to you, Matthew, in Leeds. That was, I don't know when you're listening to this podcast, but it was at the beginning of September of 2025. And I was in a bookstore to present this book precisely, and I invited a friend of mine, Dr. Florence Smith-Nichols, to help me with the discussion. I normally have a discussant with me so that we could, in a way, bounce ideas off each other and, in a way, comment on the book in a more organic fashion than me trying to lecture my own vision or my own work in a way that is also a bit masturbatory. So I invited Florence, and she is a game archaeologist. And so that part of the book, so the central idea of games can be found. Games are traces of the dead and ancient civilizations. How do we understand them? How do we play them? How do we adapt them? They're all part of this discussion. And that, in Leeds' particular case, took the center of our discussion in this book presentation. So there's 3 points I mentioned, but this one is particularly near and dear to my heart because it shows, once again, my academic little trick of studying something and then showing it to you in a practical fashion as soon as I can. So this is maybe something that you, Matthew, might want to do about your dystopian and utopian ideas, in particular in relation to games, but I would invite every humanities academics. You could do something more with your research than just writing and talking about it. There are artifacts that in a way can help or be a counterpoint or be a companion piece to whatever you do on a theoretical side. If you're interested in this idea, I recently published a paper called How to Do Philosophy with Science Fiction, in a way in which I present science fiction as a possibility, as a possible venue to express some philosophical ideas, and how different it is, how the difference between, say, the classical institutionally accepted format of the theoretical essay differs from working with artifacts and fiction as a philosopher. So this might be, maybe for your readers, another point of interest that they might pick pick up. That is, you can do more with your writing and with your doing than just theoretical essays and formal lectures. I think that makes one scholar's work more complete, more accessible, more appetizing even, and without trivializing your own work, I believe that could work as a nice hook into larger themes of your intellectual labor.
Mm. Yeah, I'm fascinated. I mean, there's lots to unpack there. I just want to sort of stick on the conduit point a little bit. And one of the things that it was making me think about at the end of the novel as well, but also just hearing you speak about it, is this idea that, you know, what the hell would they find of our civilization? What's the game that would come to represent us? Or, I think what's interesting is it's a snapshot as well, isn't it? So part of your point is that I'm sure that this culture that they uncover is much larger, but it's one person's sort of game they happen to sort of have it to entertain them. It could be absolutely anything. I mean, God knows what sort of things they might find of our civilization. Candy Crush comes to represent something fundamental about what we believe as a kind of as a species or whatever. So I thought that was a really interesting idea. I kind of think like Monopoly is the kind of quintessential game that represents 20th and 21st century human society. That sort of it's sort of dirty capitalism that's sort of you're encouraged to lord it over other people. I think there's a great advert, I think they were doing in like 2016 or something, for Monopoly, which just has these kids who are playing with their parents or whatever, and they're just love, they're, oh, you've landed on my hotel, sort of, bring it in, you bring all this, and it's almost kind of grotesque. It sort of showcases how we're indoctrinating our youth through games to think in this kind of monopoly capitalist style. But yeah, so I mean, it goes back to that sort of central thing that actually these games come to mean an awful lot, and sometimes we're kind of we're thinking about this entire civilization on the basis of this one game, and what is the ethics of doing that. And I found that to be really intriguing, and certainly with my own kind of academic hat on, that was the thing that most interested me about the novel, although I'm sure there's lots in it as well for others. I mean, it sounds like you're someone who's, as you were sort of saying, you've got a lot going on. You a lot to your academic work that stretches into different sort of areas. I wondered if you've got a current project you're working on, and if you don't mind me asking, is there something else? I mean, I think you mentioned you were thinking about a sequel to the novel, or what else are you up to at the moment?
I am very privileged in the sense that I work in a research center where my teaching hours are quite low and my research output can occupy the majority of my time. So at the moment, I'm working on a couple of journal articles, a new small philosophical game that is going to be called Hammer, coming out in spring. And perhaps I'm starting to think of maybe another fiction if I have the time and the energy to do it. But I don't know if you've ever, I mean, you wrote a book, Matthew, but it's a bit hard. Like, and I don't know, like sometimes I feel very disheartened because it's a long and painful process, but it's like giving birth and then you forget about it and you fall into this trap of trying, oh, it would be nice if I could talk about these other philosophical ideas in this other freaky format. And then you start to do it and you start to feel how terrible it was and how miserable and uncertain and how many hours need to go every day in refining your stupid non-native prose, hoping that they land with the tone and the nuance that you were expecting to land, them to land. So I have a number of projects, and as you pointed out, I'm very kind of heterogeneous in my approach. So I'm going to try to do again fiction, games, and academic work of the more classical institutional kind next to one another. Last year, among the works that we did, we organized DIGRA, which is the largest humanities game studies conference here in Malta. So that was a lot of our time into that one. This year, maybe instead I will go and do a small visiting position somewhere in another university, just for fun, because I'm so privileged and free that I can actually do these kind of things. And let me tell you, this should be the norm in academia, as in the fact that your institution supports your intellectual work and gives you responsibility and freedom as to what you discuss and in which way you contribute to society. Sadly, as you might notice, the recent changes, restrictions, especially in the Western world, have made it so that being in academia is degrading and degraded and closer to, I don't know, an employee work in which whatever you write and think and your years of preparation are not particularly valued or taken into account by whoever is currently in charge of where the university is going and how we discuss our culture, how we archive and maintain our culture, and so on. Why am I going on to this sermon? Because I think it's something that we should be talking about in terms of maybe dystopia, and because it affects, I'm sure, the majority of the people who listen to this podcast. It's dire and hopeless and hard, and I hope we will all be able to endure and lead and be the driving forces of a change back to a less anti-intellectualistic and less bean counting, less neoliberal approach to education and research. This is like maybe a small little thing that I can hope for the future. My little utopian contribution to this podcast.
Your vision, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things, isn't it, where I think if you refer to yourself as a philosopher, I think primarily, and I think philosophy is that thing that takes time, doesn't it? And you need to, how do you quantify how much time it takes for you to think about something or develop a kind of line of thinking? It's so difficult, and as you say, bean counting isn't gonna help that. Yeah, absolutely, it is difficult, and I suppose we live in a world where if you're in certain disciplines, increasingly few, you maybe have dedicated research time, but it's in the humanities in particular, it's becoming less and less, isn't it? Stefano, it's been great talking to you. I've really enjoyed it, and certainly something, this is right up my alley. So, but as a sign off, we always ask our guests to tell our audience of a text, could be a novel, movie, game in your case, perhaps, or piece of criticism. I say your own work excluded, but I think we would recommend going onto your website and having a little go at some of your games. But something that you think everyone should read or play or whatever experience. Preferably something to do with utopias and dystopias and games.
Well, I mean, as a piece of literature, I cannot recommend enough His Master's Voice by Stanislav Lem. I think it's one of the greatest science fiction speculative novels in literature. So if you haven't read it, do yourself make yourself a gift and go read it. In terms of games, I mean, there's a few. I'm thinking, for example, of a game like Citizen Sleeper. Is something that does futuristic dystopia in a way that is quite fabulous, but also, well, maybe it's a bit of a controversial idea, but I don't know if you played The Last of Us Season 2,
yes,
which is a very dire, oppressive horror game in which there's an interesting trope of violence and revenge and retaliation, which is in a way self-reflecting on how we play games and what we want from games. So it's like strangely self-reflexive and maybe pointing of a future in which we realize how, well, it's also a controversial game, so maybe it's not a good recommendation. I would say Citizen Sleeper is a more like conventional and traditional kind of dystopian work with utopian traits, which I would say recommend. If you need to play something small and utopian, maybe Citizen Sleeper or Citizen Sleeper 2, which is just out, could be good bets, I think.
I've not heard of that one. I will be looking it up. I have played Last of Us Part 2, and that is bleak, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely bleak. And I couldn't understand the controversy, but I guess it it was tied to the anti-woke discourse or whatever, and it's got sucked into that. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast, Stefano. Thanks for your time, and hope we'll catch up again soon.
Many, many thanks.
Thank you to Stefano for a really great chat about utopias and dystopias, play and found games. What We Owe the Dead has gone straight to the top of my to-be-read list, and I think I really ought to give his 2022 Fictional Games, A Philosophy of Worldbuilding and Imaginary Play a read as well. If you agree that this episode was super interesting, you can let us know by rating and following the podcast, leaving a comment, or sending us an email using the address listed in the podcast description. Next up is our Season 2 recap, in which we'll also give a sneak peek at what's to come in the future. So, please do join us next time, where we will look at some more utopian and dystopian fictions.